My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of Climate Justice Now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet. Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money.
The timeline for Earth becoming unlivable is complex and depends on various factors such as climate change and human political and cultural actions. 18 scientists collaborated on a peer-reviewed paper to put forward solutions and historical data on why societies around the world need to come together to solve humanity's most important issue, our own survival. Dr. Chip Fletcher and Dr. Phoebe Barnard join me to discuss their comprehensive paper and explain why we need to act now. A call for global cultural change to save the planet. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Charles and Phoebe, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. The editor-in-chief, Micah Hanks at The Debrief, sent me a press release titled "A Call for Global Culture Change to Save the Planet." He obviously knows my beat very, very well. And so I'm excited to have this conversation with you to talk about a comprehensive approach that this peer-reviewed paper puts forward. So thank you for joining me today. This paper is so rich with so many different subsections when it comes to climate change, politics, government, culture. There's so many different areas. To start off, can you give me a general overview of what this paper entails and what your goal was?
Phoebe, you want to take a shot at that?
I'll leave it to you and about the title, but you're the boss,
Right.
Chip. You're the leader.
Well, thank you, Phoebe. You're very gracious. The actual title of the paper is Earth at Risk,
Okay.
an urgent call to end the age of destruction and forge a just and sustainable future. And this paper, the original draft of it was written by myself. It's basically the collection of about 2 years of me taking findings of peer-reviewed science related to climate change, global disease, pollution, biodiversity loss, and social inequality, and taking these findings and sort of stuffing them in a Word doc over the years, referencing them, and then finally deciding to go in and stitch it all together into a cohesive narrative. And what we do for the first time in my knowledge is take these 5 global emergencies, again, climate change, biodiversity loss, ecological destruction, social inequality, disease, and pollution, string them together and show how they are interrelated and lead to amplifying feedbacks. For instance, climate change leads to amplifying feedbacks in disease as the zone of the tropics expands towards the poles, and we see more and more tropical diseases entering into communities and ecosystems that had never experienced them before. Climate change leads to extreme weather events, which typically are followed by disease, dysentery, and other types of diseases, which become the main focus of first responders after a community hazard, a extreme weather hazard. The community responders spend months responding to diseases rather than to the original, say, earthquake or tsunami or hurricane or something like that. Climate change makes these worse and also brings those extreme weather events together. And the paper calls for a cultural shift that fundamentally these problems are rooted in an extractive view of nature where humans have developed an economic model that is deeply rooted in racism. It's deeply rooted in profit accumulation and wealth and indigenous erasure. You go back 500-600 years into the history of colonialism, and we still see the effects of colonialism, European spreading around the world, colonizing indigenous populations, and then with decolonization, for instance, leaving India or leaving Indonesia, leaving portions of Central and South America, the new government that takes over never returns the land to the indigenous population. And so we have indigenous erasure. And it's these original communities that know how to live on the land in the most sustainable way. And we haven't seen the global impacts of this until the last several decades when human population has exploded, of course. And we are using up the natural resources that we rely on. And so we call for a cultural shift to go back to an economic model that's not based on profit or wealth accumulation. It should be based on sustainability, true scientific concepts of sustainability. We're not asking for a return to hunter-gatherer society. We are asking for a forward movement to a healthy, rich, and most likely heavily digital future where we don't use up resources as a regular part of our economic activities. So that's the summary of the paper. And the original paper was put up on a Google Doc, and word of mouth. I invited co-authors who came in and reshaped it. Phoebe was a major contributor, adding lots and lots of rich content. And the large group of authors consists of men and women. We are a diverse group from the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere. We have artists, we have lawyers, we have scientists. We have folks from all walks of life, all types of professions, all contributing to this call for a cultural shift in how humanity treats itself as well as how we treat the planet.
I love that. It's an amazing summary, Chip. That was really well done. How did all of you come together? Like, there's such a diverse group of people that obviously have the same morals and values when it comes to creating sustainable change. But how did you all meet?
It was word of mouth. We have never all been together at the same time. I invited a couple of folks. I think the first person I asked to join me was Camilo Mora, who is a climate scientist here at University of Hawaii. I also know Kamana Beamer, and Michael Mann is a friend. Daviana McGregor is an ethnologist here at the University of Hawaii. Bill Ripple at University of Oregon is someone I've been acquainted with, and I asked him for some names, and I think he recommended Phoebe and Tom Newsom, and just word of mouth. I also have an undergraduate student here, a journalism major, Ashiwarya Bell, who is a co-author, who went through the entire paper and corrected grammar and taught me lots of things about run-on sentences. So everything from undergraduates to very advanced, famous climate scientists. And it's all just sort of finding folks who I think immediately caught on to the purpose of the paper, the nexus of the paper, and expressed a lot of enthusiasm for it and contributed to its content.
The way I see it, Chrissy, is that we are now at a certain crossroads of humanity, crossroads of civilization in particular. And when you've got a powerful idea that needs to be shared, it's kind of like a condensation nucleus. You know, Chip's an atmospheric scientist, so he thinks that way. But I think in terms of the metaphors of a bubbling honeypot of activity and ideas. And actually, Chip, I was invited onto the paper by Eileen Christ. And Chrissy, from my perspective, this paper was partly important because it was a really great collaboration of both Indigenous and Western thinkers, scientists, yes, but also historians, futurists, sociologists, cultural scholars, artists, and so on. And that really helped us think about the, out of the box state in which we need to find ourselves. We are not just producing another academic paper, hopefully with a high impact, but we are trying to grab the attention of people and say, we're right at the crossroads here. We need to decide to turn left or right. And if we fail to choose, we will end up almost inevitably letting go of ourselves as a species that has a civilization, has order in our societies. And we see this already happening in so many countries around the world. So there's that. And I think having 18 people of the caliber that Chip and others managed to put together was a fabulous thing. Sir David King, for example, the British chief scientist, on four different administrations of British government, remarkably doughty and tough and very sharp person. So we've ended up with a bunch of important people in different fields saying, wake up, people, this is it. We're now here and we've got to choose. Age of destruction, age of regeneration. If we are mindful and intentional and proactive, then we can retain a civilization. But if we fail to choose, it will continue to disintegrate.
What steps does the paper suggest that people in society, in multiple societies, this is just not a Western, this is an Eastern, this is a global issue. What steps do countries around the world have to take to create solutions, and the solutions that you're suggesting in here?
We make a point of, the paper is structured in, first it's a review of these 5 global emergencies, but then we go into 2 sections at the end of the paper, which are significant portions of the paper, into calling for a new era of reciprocity with nature, kinship with nature, and among human societies. And we call for rapid and legitimate decarbonization. There has unfortunately grown up a new commercial marketplace of selling carbon credits that, when examined closely, shows that there is no validation to these carbon credits. Trees and forests that would be growing anyway are now being counted by companies, sold, in fact, by companies to as an excuse to continue emitting greenhouse gases. So legitimate decarbonization is very different than the new marketplace of carbon credits that has sprung up. And I'm pleased to say that there are now new companies whose mission is to validate and account for whether or not carbon credits being used by governments and companies to continue polluting are legitimate. So there are checks and balances slowly emerging in the marketplace. Another important call is for revising the basis for decision-making under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We've all watched one year after another as the COPs, the conferences of parties, which are held every year by the UNFCCC, fail to make significant progress. Nearly every nation has a net zero pledge by 2045 or 2050. And also nearly every nation is investing in fossil fuels and enacting policies that will fail to achieve those pledges. So the promises and the actual policies are very different. This is a gap. And in fact, it's such a prevalent gap that the United Nations issues every year what's called a gap report, analyzing this problem between international promises to cut our greenhouse gas emissions and our actual policies and investments in coal and oil and other fossil fuels. On the one hand, these promises to decarbonize will lead us to an eventual temperature rise above the pre-industrial period of about 2.4 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. We have global heating now that has reached 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial background, the natural background temperature as an average temperature. And if you add up all the promises, it would put us on a pathway to about 2.5 degrees. But if you add up all the policies and investments, the more realistic and actual pathway, it takes us to 3 degrees Celsius net warming. And we have papers telling us that at 2.7 degrees and 3 degrees Celsius, 1/3 of humanity will be displaced because 1/5 of the land surface on this planet will be equivalent to the deep interior of the Sahara Desert. Unlivable, extreme heat. And this is just an outcome that's not acceptable. And we are halfway there already at 1.5 degrees net warming.
I have spoken with multiple different people when it comes to global for climate change and temperatures rising. You know, there is a major concern of that and that happening. I know that there's papers in 2012 from the Pentagon that came out noting that there would be a major increase in climate and there would be tons of climate refugees. And it's something that if we don't do action now, that will be an issue that we will have within the future. And that started in 2012. So there's tons of papers and reviews saying this, but we just don't acknowledge it, unfortunately, as a species. And my thoughts to that are potentially that, you know, we have a really hard time evaluating our own personal demise, let's say our own personal death. How are we even able then to look at the world? We can't even look at it daily from our own perspective, and we won't even acknowledge it daily. Let's say we don't do that. How can we do that on a global scale if we can't do it individually?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good questions, fundamental to our choices right now. And I think it's clear to me that at this crossroads, we need to choose to be the best kind of people that we can be, or fail to choose and end up being the worst kind of people that we can be. And it's really a choice between being proactive and intentional or reactive and violent and resentful. And with climate migration, for example, that's going to be, it is already for many people, especially in the United States, a hot button issue. I've worked on climate migration, just as an aside on that issue, both in humans and in other species, trying to help adaptation to climate by helping local communities in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm living now, welcome migrants, absorb them into society, put them to work. And now that I'm subsequently working on large-scale global regeneration and restoration of ecosystems, a number of us around the world are asking, to what extent can these ecosystem restoration camps and sites and hubs around the world also help absorb skilled climate migrants who have been farmers or teachers or cooks or project managers, and help them really engage with the, I think, civilizational scale work ahead of shifting us into a regenerative mindset. But it is very much about behavior change, as you and Chip have mentioned, that we have a mindset of entitlement, maybe of human supremacy. We think of ourselves as the only thing that matters. It's almost as though we're still thinking that the earth you know, the sun revolves around the earth. The sun revolves around humanity. I'm a biodiversity scientist and an evolutionary behavioral ecologist originally. And so I think about our evolutionary behaviors and how they've led us to this moment. And so when it comes to action, I guess I would say a couple of things. One, climate change is, of course, just one symptom, and I think Chip alluded to this earlier, is just one symptom of our mindsets, our economies, and our population. And I've been running global initiatives that deal with those issues. So I see our mindsets and our ecological overshoot as really the root cause that give rise to the symptoms of dangerous climate change, biodiversity loss, plastics pollution, road rage, and unemployment. You know, everything from most social problems to virtually all environmental problems are all just symptoms of these same problems. In terms of actions, I think there's been increasing agreement in the scientific community that we need to be looking at multiple core actions. In 2021, for COP26, a bunch of us put together a paper that's colloquially known as SWIA, World Scientists' Warnings into Action, Local to Global. And that identified 6 different sets of issues, from energy and nature and food systems and population and biodiversity and the economy. 6 issues at 6 scales, from the individual and household scale right the way up to global scale, on 3 timelines: 2026, because a lot of planning in cities and counties and nations goes on that kind of planning time horizon; 2030, because a lot of things are, you know, being planned for 2030; and then 2050. These are the 3 timelines that we need to get to grips with. We're now virtually halfway through 2024, and we have not been making anything like the progress that we need to be doing. So there was that. And those 6 areas of issue in that paper themselves led from the 2019 paper, 2020 paper, that Bill Ripple and Tom Newsom and a number of us in this current paper led by Chip Fletcher collaborated on, called World Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency. We said some of the same things in that paper, and a lot of the actions are, you know, drawing into this current paper. What can people at the household and individual level do to shift our society? And it's not just about changing light bulbs, it's more about changing the light bulbs in our brain, about our relationship not only to nature, with nature, but our relationships with each other. Stop having, you know, the sense of entitlement and extractive dominance and inequity that pervades and pollutes, poisons our society today, and move to a completely different mindset. There's a lot of history of climate changes through volcanic eruptions and other things throughout history. And we know that those episodes of climate cooling, for example, with significant volcanic eruptions, are associated with political, economic, and social disruption and instability. So we know what is likely to happen unless we learn from history, unless we take charge, unless we are intentional and proactive about making these changes.
I do feel that the military-industrial complex really plays a massive part in this when it comes to climate, culture, society. Do you feel that potentially the demise of the military-industrial complex would be a start to a progressive future?
That's a big question. What is the military-industrial complex? Number one. I think that where I am in this is not to completely throw out our current economic model, but instead to promote shifts in thinking in multiple sectors of our society, pointing out to, for instance, the commercial folks who run large companies who might be involved in the commercial military industrial complex, that sustainability is the key to their successful economic future as well. And as you mentioned, the military has been on top of the problem of climate migration and border conflict for quite a while. The military also serve as first responders into communities that have been hit by extreme weather events. They recognize that they are often the first folks to go into a place that is suffering an extreme weather shock. And so they have geared up their medical, hospitalization, food resources, shelter resources, etc. I recommend everybody to watch a documentary called Age of Consequences, which I think was on Netflix. It's now several years old, pre-COVID, right? We live in a pre-COVID and post-COVID world these days. Age of Consequences shows that the military is tying border conflict and community displacement and migration to climate change shocks and stressors. So they seem to already be on board. We need to get the commercial folks on board to shift their mindset from wealth accumulation to sustainability as an actual metric that they measure as part of their company's fiduciary responsibility to stockholders. And we're starting to see the ESG environment, socialization, and governance idea take hold in the investment community. It's encountering challenges and bottlenecks, but ESG, through many investors and stockholders, is being required of corporations. And so that's going to be extremely important to see that grow. And then governments need to enact policies to push this cultural shift forward. Governments need to invest in media and art forms that inform the public about these problems. Governments need to invest in curricular development for public education and public schooling that push these problems forward, and so that we understand them, so that we're growing future voters who vote on these issues as core issues. Sustainability, we only have one planet. Earth is our lifeboat in the cosmic sea of space. No one's going to come and rescue us. These things need to be core principles that people understand. And yes, there's individual action, but individual action will only take us so far. So I'm against drunk driving. So I don't drink and drive. But that's not going to change the problem of drinking and driving unless there's a government policy against drinking and driving. Then you start to see a cultural shift. So government policies are very important. Individual action is the first step, but we need policies. So, commercial, government, large federal and commercial military complexes, all of these sectors, I think, are beginning to wake up and have been slowly waking up over the last 2 or 3 decades. But the whole thing needs to accelerate. And one of the purposes of this paper is to continue to push on this slowly opening door.
Awesome. Phoebe, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do. And it's always interesting to get together 18 people, most of whom have never met face to face, from very different fields and from quite different initial paradigms and mindsets. And so, like I say, I think the collaboration of Indigenous thinkers and more sort of Western trained scientists and academics has been really interesting for me. And I think it's one of the values of the paper. Yes, systems are increasingly dysfunctional in our world, increasingly broken. I suspect that all 18 of us might have quite different answers to your question about systemic change. I've worked a lot on ecological overshoot and how to reduce human impact on the planet. So personally, I don't see how we can add a net new 80 million people to the planet every year and not have degrowth, economic degrowth. And it's important to ask the clear questions of, what kind of a society do we want from here on in, and how are we going to get there from here? We can't just erase capitalism or democracy as it's currently dysfunctionally practiced in the USA and replace them with better versions overnight. I've long held the view since I was a kid, really, that democracy, the best experiment that we've ever had, I believe, in governance, was not likely to be up to the challenge that I could see even then. I'm 62 now, but even when I was a teenager, I could see would be coming. And that feeling has increased in the last few decades. But certainly capitalism, as it's currently practiced, has led us to the brink of this abyss. I don't think many people disagree with that. Can we go forward with a different kind of capitalism? Possibly. I would like to say, in response to something Chip said, that yes, the military, and I would also say certain industries which are particularly risk-focused, have seen the writing on the wall for many decades. Chrissy, you mentioned 2012. I think that's a USA figure. In many countries, it's been longer ago than that. I've spent most of my career working in Southern Africa, for example, and in Namibia, we set up that country's founding national biodiversity program, national climate change program in the mid-1990s. And already these issues were well understood as risk factors for African countries. And the militaries of those countries and certain industries, for example, insurance, deal with risk as a matter of practice. So they understand risk. Now, businesses in general should understand risk. This is kind of why we push to have Earth at Risk as the title of the paper, because risk is central to the issues we face. And so helping people understand all of these issues surrounding climate and adaptation and survival, not as political issues, but as issues of survival and risk, will determine how we push forward with any of the systems that we currently have. And yes, we need systemic change. And yes, we need individual change. Both are important. And I guess if I want to say anything about behavioral change, it's that I really hope that all of us, 8 billion people plus on the planet, can understand that we need to keep our hands steady on the tiller, if I can use the sailing analogy. When we have rapid social change, there is such instability inherent in that. We've got to restrain ourselves from bickering and finger pointing about whether it's systemic change, whether we've got to go after the fossil fuel companies, and once we do, everything will be fine, whether each one of us has a share of responsibility, whether it's, everything, everywhere, all at once, that we need to bring to the table all kinds of solutions. And instead of descending into disagreements about which is, important and which isn't, we have the gene pool of 8 billion people to help innovate, make change, bring solutions to the table. And in my other after hours life as a film co-producer, we are busy evaluating the realm of climate restoration, active drawdown of methane and CO2 from the atmosphere. And there's a lot of tech startups in that space, which are really trying to show that they can go to scale and bring down gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. Will most of them succeed? Unlikely. Will some of them succeed at being able to come to scale where there's good public-private partnerships? Maybe. So I just feel that as a global society, we need to manage our understanding of what these times are calling us to be. And one of those is to manage our social cohesion to get us through the gauntlet of the next decades.
You know, I really feel that systemic change has started from counterculture movements. We see environmentalism. We see from even drag would be one of those two when we look at gender as part of this. So I feel that those counterculture movements have pushed this type of forward thinking and open-mindedness. Do you feel that any modern day counterculture movements will be leading this type of change?
Well, I do want to mention the great risk to rapid counterculture change is almost always, as we're seeing in the USA, backlash. And if you've been watching that, I guess he's a CNN journalist, Fareed Zakaria, who recently wrote a book, The Age of Revolutions. I think one of the fundamental points in that book, as I understand it, I haven't had time to read it, but I've watched a couple of his interviews with people like Max Boot and other journalists about the book. One of the key messages of that book is that when social change happens too quickly, there is always a backlash. And so we need to prepare for it, be mindful of it, try to reduce its power by bringing people along with us and expect it to happen. Nonetheless, right now, as I see it, we have to make incredibly rapid, almost impossible odds change on at least 7 different dimensions at once. Climate solutions change and other technological change, economic change, political systems change, social, cultural change, behavioral, psychological, maybe spiritual change, because faith communities around the world are often very clear about the direction of change that we need to be going in. And so they are, you know, really powerful conveyors of this idea. So all of these changes have to happen in the next decade or so. How can we possibly manage that without disintegrating into anarchy? We have to be very intentional about it. And maybe just let me say, because I was lucky to live and work for the governments and the universities of Namibia and South Africa at really pivotal points in their own history. Namibia at its independence from colonial rule. South Africa shortly after its democratic transition from the poisonousness of apartheid. I felt very privileged to be in those 2 countries at a time when they were asking themselves, what kind of a society do we want to have from here on in, and how are we going to get there? And both of those 2 sides of the equation are equally important. But now I believe we need to ask that at a global level and involve 8 billion people at some level in these discussions. It's a massive challenge for humanity.
It's a massive, massive challenge, but it needs to be done. Yeah. I'm curious to see what you both think when it comes to the political, maybe perspective of this paper. You know, I really don't believe there's such thing as left and right. I really don't. But I could see that some people would read this and say, well, this is just a leftist mentality. It's just a liberal mentality. What would you say to people that feel that this is just all left and that's what it is? It's politically fueled.
Missy, I really like or Chrissy, excuse me. your question about, oh, what was the term you used?
Counterculture?
Counterculture. Yeah, I recently saw a talk by Dr. Mika Tosca, who is a transsexual climate scientist, and pushing art as a medium through which to communicate to much larger groups of people the problems associated with climate change. Mika was a scientist with NASA and found that the data that they were producing on wildfire around the world was not being used. It wasn't really leading to changes that she saw needed to be enacted around the world. And so she moved to this idea of using art as a way to communicate climate change issues. And she works with grade school kids all the way up through adult groups, educating them about climate change and then providing them with encouragement and materials to express what they're feeling and what they're thinking about climate change, present and future. So yes, your question regarding our paper is simply a liberal trope, sort of aggressive wording that you did not use. That's always a risk. One reason it is so heavily referenced is so that it becomes harder and harder to deny. It's not an op-ed, right? It's not a bunch of us getting together and deciding to write an opinion piece for the New York Times. It is a proper peer-reviewed scientific journal paper. It is a review of the science in multiple areas, 5 global emergencies, and weaving them together to lead to a narrative of change. I believe that people are more open-minded than we give them credit for. I believe that people will take a moment and try to find the truth, the nugget of truth that's buried in all the information that we receive. And I use this analogy when I'm dealing with human resources issues in my role as Dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology here at University of Hawaii. There's a nugget of truth buried in criticism that we all receive, and I very often have to coach other faculty and folks here in my school to realize that they aren't being attacked if someone criticizes them, but rather it's a gift, and deep inside there to unwrap where the truth is. And I believe everybody, if they will work on removing their self-defenses and opening themselves up to new information, will realize that a planet approaching 8.5 billion people and on scale to reach 10.5 billion people is simply not a viable enterprise. We simply are not, the scale of humanity and the overreach of our resource exploitation is apparent to anybody who takes a moment to think about it. So, that's one off-the-cuff reaction to, is this simply a progressive liberal op-ed?
It's not a manifesto. It's a matter of telling it as it is, of what we need to do if we're going to survive as individuals, as a society, as a civilization, for sure. But, we have to be super real here. All of my 38 years living outside the country until I came back to the US about 10 days before the inauguration of Donald Trump led me to observe the degree to which American culture and American binary thinking was increasingly pushed out to the rest of the world. I think we're reaping the wins that we sowed then by, TV broadcasters choosing to outsource the bold and the beautiful which was on TV in Namibia and Uganda and other places that I've lived for decades. And so I guess my point is that we have aggressively pushed out a certain brand of culture, society, of economy, of value systems, and I suppose a yearning for the consumptive, high consumption, wealthy lifestyle. But right now, we have social media actively poisoning the dialogues that we have about the future with the kind of tropes that Chip mentions. And we mustn't be naive about the odds that we face as a result of that. Short of shutting down social media and Fox News and CNN for that matter, it is going to be very difficult to get people away from reactive, binary, tribal thinking. And when you live for a long time in Africa and then go back to the States and see tribalism playing out in its most vicious kind of way in your own country of your own birth, it's quite upsetting to see. So how can we do this without making these kinds of big, unpopular, transformative changes? I don't know, but I do try to appeal to people to keep their hand steady on the tiller and try to be the best people that they can be, and B, try to restrain themselves from reactive insults and bickering and finger pointing. The odds are long and the hill is steep, but we have to climb it.
We have no choice. Yeah, we have no choice. And if we choose not to, we won't be here.
Yeah.
This paper mainly, from what I can tell, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, looks at this from a Western perspective. You know, what are your thoughts then on the Eastern perspective of this and how the world should move forward in the future? And was the Eastern perspective thought about when writing this?
I think Indigenous, and I'd like to suggest that Chip have a stab at this, because some of the voices that I brought into the paper and tried to reflect myself were much more from an Indigenous perspective, not necessarily an Eastern perspective per se.
Yeah, Phoebe's right. We have a number of Indigenous authors, and I had a number of side conversations with them regarding their perspective. They were very happy with the paper. They thought the narrative, the direction, the points being made were very appropriate. The idea of kinship with nature is a deeply Indigenous idea. Here in Hawaii, we are recognizing this with increasing prevalence in our education systems and our government systems. You know, Hawaii is a stolen nation. We illegally overthrew the king and queen of Hawaii over 100 years ago, and this is still prevalent in families across Hawaii. It was their grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandparents that actually lived through that experience and were devastated by the westernization of water systems, agricultural systems, food production systems of all types. So it was important to me to get this Indigenous perspective. And that's where things like probably the most famous perspective on nature that comes from indigeneity is the agroforest. Many Westerners think that a kinship with nature or a conservation approach is to simply leave nature alone. And yes, there is a role for that. But the agroforest is an example of how humans can live with Earth successfully, where we actively manage the forest to produce food while still keeping it healthy. It is not a humans hands-off kind of approach. It's a strongly, sustainably, scientifically informed, nurturing family member approach, where nature is viewed as literally a member of our family, and that we are ancestors or have ancestors that are from primary food sources. We have ancestors that are natural organisms. So, of course, all of that broke down with colonialism. All of that broke down with indigenous erasure. All of that is broken down with the slash and burn extractive resource exploitation that wealth-oriented capitalism promotes. With regard to the more Eastern approach, the Chinese really embrace the idea of an eco-civilization, a community that lives and relies on ecology as the basis of its existence. Whether or not they fulfill that philosophy everywhere, it could be discussed and challenged, but the idea of an eco-civilization certainly is consistent with what we're trying to push in this paper. Yeah.
Co-authors, sorry, Chrissy. For example, the sociologist Eileen Christ have really been incredibly articulate at conveying the idea of an ecological civilization into Western societies. She was a professor at Virginia Tech, for example. But I think all the ancient societies of our planet, including indigenous societies, including Chinese culture, have wisdom on this line and have been watching Western capitalism and Western individualism stray further and further away from that. I don't agree that there's been complete erasure. And many of the indigenous cultural bridges, as I call them, and indigenous organizations that I'm now working with in my current day job are very much focused on bringing the wisdoms that they have still been nurturing and keeping alive within their own cultures to step out and say, okay, we can actually help all of humanity here. Please, let's work together, listen to us. And so my friend Jay Bowen, who is a co-author on this paper, an artist, a traditional healer who nonetheless works with Western medicine to try and bring the two together, and a futurist in his own way, he would be the first to say that.
From the Eastern and the Western perspectives, there are many things within this paper that people would agree upon, right? I think with climate change, we could see that both sides would agree. I feel culturally, we'd have a lot of issues. We look at gender, for example, and gender justice might be something that is not agreed upon. So my last question then to you is, the paper does talk about how gender justice can contribute to helping solve these challenges. Why is gender so important in this conversation?
I think that gender issues are critical with regard to the overpopulation problem. It's also an ethical and moral issue. In many, many communities, extreme weather events put at much greater risk the female members of that community. Female members are the ones who linger behind in dangerous situations to take care of the elderly and the young and other members of the family. Females are tasked with the responsibility of bringing the belongings, finding the food, taking care of the family. This puts them in harm's way. And ironically, they are not typically involved or included in the decision-making of how a community will form itself and how it will grow resilience. And obviously, this is an immoral situation, and we see clear statistical numbers that women, and I will include in this children and the elderly and the ill, are at vastly greater risk when it comes to climate shocks and stresses. Also, it's been shown that female empowerment, education, All of these lead to fertility decisions that will strengthen the community, build resilience in the community, and reduce population growth. So this is a critical part of the solution on a global scale for the problems that the paper discusses.
I see the role of other genders in getting us through this gauntlet as fundamentally not just of vulnerability, but of leadership, of true design, co-design with others. I've been working most of my working life on women's leadership, career development, collaborative reframing of issues. And so that issue is fundamentally, the question you asked us is fundamentally important. Women evolutionarily are the caretakers, the group planners, the future thinkers in a way that not all men are. Some are, especially in our society now, and some are not. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of leadership have we witnessed over the last 150 years, and where has it got us? And what kind of leadership can we take from here going forward? So yes, women, children, the elderly, other genders are extremely vulnerable in the highly binary, divisive culture that the US in particular has concocted now. But we are also the solution to many of the problems we face. So a lot of the work that I do in women's leadership and eldership is focused on helping women get to the level of visibility, strategy, and confidence to help take the world forward from here.
Chip and Phoebe, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today and being rebelliously curious.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Cheers for now.